I'm just going to introduce myself.
Thank you, Rabbi Thiede.
Thank you. Wonderful. Let's move right along. We all know each other by this point. So I'm going to start with a quote from Darren Guest, one of my very, very favorite scholars. She's going to come back in the third of these class series. And let me give you a sense of the trajectory. We're going to start today thinking about God and God's relationship to the non-human animal world. I use those words deliberately because, of course, human beings are also animals, right? And she will come back when we get to that third session. Our second session, which was advertised as Feeling the Feels, probably made you go, wait, what? Right? So what that session will be about is the ways in which God in the Hebrew Bible, otherwise known for the Jewish community as Tanakh, the way God expresses emotions in a bodily form. We are so used to thinking of God, especially in Jewish tradition, as non-corporeal. I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate and show you how bodily that God is. And our third session will address issues of gender, where I will ask you, why is it that we have this manifest need to constantly say he, and whether there's really a way to make a dent in that, rethink what divine presence looks like and how we might refer to divine presence in ways that change our vision of what we know of as binary oppositions, female and male, that emerge so often in the Hebrew Bible and Tanakh, and also, of course, in what scholars call Greek Testament, and you would call the New Testament. So this comment from Darren Guest, I would like you to keep in mind. Darren Guest, along with me and other scholars, ask the question of what do we do with texts that actually can harm individuals? And she writes, we have an ethical responsibility to challenge such texts. So just keep this in mind, that she's speaking now about the diminishment of lives of people, i.e. the human animals. And then we're going to start with those common assumptions that we often hear, that God actually at the get-go gives human dominion and rule over human animals. And today what I want to do is to trouble this idea, right? This is a dominant common assumption that that's our role vis-a-vis non-human animals. So let's see what happens when we look at this. I want to take us back to Genesis 2:19, a very famous scene in which God, who seems not to understand the plumbing of his own male creation, as I have said to you before, lines up a whole slew of non-human animals in front of Adam for Adam to name those animals. And of course, we all know that a fitting partner is not found. In a way, this is a comic moment, really. Two guys trying to figure it out, and it turns out, no, the porcupine's not going to work. And what happens here, according to the philosopher Jacques Derrida, he describes what's going on in positioning. If we position, imagine the placement of God and Adam and the animals, where do we end up and what happens to our vision? These living things came into the world before the Adam and have to be named after him. Well, what happens? Adam ends up being caught in the middle between God's gaze on the animals that are to be named and the animals' gaze to Adam, who is going to name them. Adam is in the middle. He is in the coinciding point of these two gazes, God and the animals. I just want you to imagine that. And if a chill did not go through your body, you might want to think whether it should have. Right? It's God and the animals looking at the human animal. We tend to see this text as God and Adam looking at the non-human animals. But we can rethink this text. And we might want to start with, well, where does God stand in vis-a-vis these other kinds of creations? And the reason I mention is that God twice in the Hebrew Bible does something like a woman, not as a woman, like a woman. I'm going to come back to that in 2 more class sessions. But God frequently is not only doing things like a non-human animal, but in fact, as a non-human animal. Yes, I saw that expression of, what? Where is she going with this? My job is to prove it to you, right? So I lived for a long time in Missouri, the Shogun state. That's what we're gonna do. So God acts like a lion in 2 capacities vis-a-vis Israel. In one of them, protecting Israel. You see a sample text here from Hosea, where God will roar like a lion, and his children will come trembling from the west. And at times, God actually serves as an attacking lion who is taking some opportunity to be aggressive towards his, in the text, in some way recalcitrant or unworthy people. So in both of these cases, we see God acting like a lion. And I want you to think about these issues. This is just an aside to keep in mind as we go forward, especially over these sessions, that we have a textual subordination of both animals and women in these texts that we, again, want to kind of just hold as we read through these texts. The Hebrew Bible also repeatedly describes this deity as a shepherd, and the Israelites are put in the position of being the non-human animals, sheep and goats. And one of the things that we might want to think about is the way in which biblical characters are themselves frequently named after animals. And you can see some examples here where Rachel, her name means a ewe. Yael means a mountain goat, though you can also read that name in a third-person masculine way, which completely confuses your understanding of what gender Yael is representing. So, folks, it's frequently more than one possibility, but this is one possible translation of her name. Caleb means dog. Goliath's name is likely to come from an etymological line that means lion. So we have the human animals frequently themselves, in some ways, developing a relationship to the non-human animals through their names and as representations or embodiments of some sort of what these animals themselves represent. God, too, is named after a non-human animal. Now, you'll see this frequently. How often have I talked to you about what translators are doing in order to kind of make things more comfortable for you, right? They're doing that all the time. They're doing that to make things sound like Bible. And the actual Hebrew is often so much more raw and funny and difficult than we know. One of those cases is this translation of the mighty one of Jacob, which shows up 3 times. It's an interesting translation because the deity is being referred to as Navir. And what does that word mean? A bull. The deity is referred to as a bull, not the mighty one. Now, bulls have a long-standing history in the ancient Near East when it comes to deities. There are so many depictions of deities in that world wearing a horned hat. Do any of you know what I'm talking about? Because they themselves are seen as strong beings who embody the very nature of a bull. The aggressive horned hat is meant to symbolize their relationship to those bulls. And El, god of the Canaanites, who gets absorbed by the Israelites into what Jews call Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, or Adonai Elohim, right? That Canaanite deity is a bull god and is frequently described as a bull god. And you might want to think about the altars. How many of you know what's on the altars in ancient history? Horns, right? bull's horns. So deities of this ancient world are frequently associated with this particular animal. They are also often associated with lions, by the way. So lions and bulls. This part of me is going, lions and tigers and bears. God is also described as having the horns of a wild ox in both Numbers 23 and 24. So now, if you imagine that deity, you are looking at a very embodied God. Right? That God has a body, and as we'll find out next week, that body expresses emotions through his bodily organs. You'll often hear Jews say, I felt it in my kishkis, right? Which means like down here, right, in the bowel area. I felt nervous or I felt anxious in my kishkis. Well, you're going to find out next week the extent to which God feels it in God's kishkis. It's in the texts. And it's interesting. So here we have God being named after an animal. And in very typical Rabbi Thiede kinds of forms, I'm not bothering to pay any attention to the sheets of paper that tell me which slides are coming, am I? So, question becomes, is God ever a non-human animal in our texts? And the answer is yes. Particularly in Lamentations, we find really good examples of God being described as a lurking bear and as a lion in an absolutely extraordinarily painful text, where the Gever, the strong man of Lamentations 3, is speaking about how God has tormented him. It is a difficult text, a painful text. It is so graphically painful that it almost reads as a kind of ancient version of what happens during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. The Gever is imprisoned. He is nothing but bones. He's been trapped, right? You can read this text in the light of what happens during World War II, and you will recognize those descriptions. And God, in this chapter, is first portrayed as an assailant, as an attacker, as an enemy. And the Gever must go through sequential stages to rediscover his own hope that God will return, that God will notice, come back, and care for him. And as a natural result, the Israelites as a whole. But he describes God, the biblical author gives the Gever the chance to describe God as these two creatures, as a bear and as a lion. And again, God being described as the bull of Jacob, as I mentioned earlier. This is not unique to ancient Israel or biblical texts. Assyria and Babylon are also described as lions not only in biblical texts, but in their own texts. And we find other extraordinarily beautiful texts in which God is described as having wings, right? So God has horns, but God also has wings, and God can protect with those wings. One of the most beautiful prayers in Jewish liturgy happens at the beginning of a service. It's called Baruchi Nafshi, and it is a prayer that includes the experience of putting on a prayer shawl. And in that prayer, a Jew says, your wings are covering me, are comforting me. I am wrapping myself in your wings. The talit, that prayer shawl, is understood as a kind of physical manifestation of God's protective wings. Isn't that beautiful? Right? So here we have both the difficult associations and some associations which are in fact lovely. As so often happens in our biblical texts, whether they are the Hebrew Bible or the Greek Bible, what you might call, I would say with some challenges, the Old and the New Testament, and there are always various aspects of the way animals get depicted. The non-human animals can often be used in highly negative terms, even to bestialize a human character. And here are some examples where Ishmael, I'm sure you remember this one, is described as a wild ass of a man. His hand against everyone against him. Right? That's Ishmael is then made into and associated with an animal who is unpredictable and potentially aggressive and frightening. Similarly, an ancestor of a non-Israelite clan is given the name Hamor, donkey. This is a way in which, do any of you know that story in Genesis 34 where you would call her Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, goes out to meet other girls of the land, and instead she meets with the prince of Shechem, who, in my reading, takes her and rapes her. And his father's name is Donkey. So there's some work being done here to signify the bestial nature of the opponents of the Israelites. Of course, as we know, there's bestial behavior on the part of the sons of Jacob, if you're thinking in those terms, who wait until all the men of Shechem have undergone a circumcision and cannot fight back, and they go in and slaughter those men and take the women, the children, and the animals for themselves as booty. It's a pretty scary chapter. Egyptians and their gods are associated regularly with the genitalia of donkeys and the emissions of stallions. Again, the Hebrew text, this is also, by the way, truer of Greek texts than you might imagine, can be much more graphic than our translations will often admit. They can be graphic in a way that is quite shocking. And these texts are among such texts. I give you an example where the men of Jerusalem themselves are described as well-fed, lusting stallions, each neighing for the wife of his neighbor. Yikes! Right? Didn't talk about these texts in Sunday school, did they? Or did they? You don't remember this conversation, I'm assuming. Okay, so something is new here. That's always good. Yeah, and those kinds of texts can be found in ways that can be quite disturbing for our understanding of what the biblical authors are doing in regard to using this language around animals in order to bestialize human beings. And yet, sometimes those comparisons are among the most positive and beautiful you can ever possibly imagine. An Israelite poem essentially praises Saul and Jonathan as swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. That's the kind of thing that inspires us, right? When the association with the animal world suddenly becomes a beautiful one, a compelling one, a soul-enriching one. And God as an animal too can be something beautiful. One of my favorite texts is the one that describes God as an eagle carrying the Israelites to freedom. When Ethiopian Jews were airlifted out of dangerous situations, they imagined these planes and spoke about these planes in the context of this verse, of God carrying them to safety. And I think this idea that a bird whose majesty cannot be gainsaid is the embodiment of a divine power that is compassionate, caring, nurturing, and saving. Who among us would not want to go to sleep in troubled times with the idea that God can carry us on God's wings or enfold us in those very same wings? I invite you to consider doing just that in the next evenings or at any time when you need the comfort of feeling safe in times that feel so dangerous to so many of us. Isn't that beautiful? It is. I thought it would be good to touch a little bit on the monsters of Hebrew Bible, right? We forget about these characters, the Leviathan and the Behemoth. But here, we have a really interesting issue. The Leviathan is both a creature in which battles with God and is crushed by God in Psalm 74. And yet, in Psalm 104, the Leviathan plays with God, is a playmate to God. Just imagine that. God's not having playtime with human animals. God is having playtime with a difficult to imagine monstrous animal, right? Playtime with the Leviathan. I think that's something that we should also envision too. What we often feel is monstrous and frightening, something that we have to crush. Can it be something that we can reimagine in a playful way? And I say this because I'm doing just that in the Society for Biblical Literature's conference this fall. The very texts that I have written about in terms of their misogyny against women, rabbinic texts about the creation of Eve, I am turning on their head because I'm tired. I'm tired. And I want to see it a different way. And I looked at all those texts that I've written about and published about, and I thought, you know what? It's hysterically funny how the rabbis keep pointing out that God isn't managing to control Eve. I'll just give you one example so that you can apply it to this kind of vision. So in a rabbinic text, God says, what part of Adam shall I take to create Eve? And every single part's going to lead to trouble. If he takes Eve from Adam's tongue, she's going to talk continuously. If he takes Eve from his hands, she's going to have her hands in every pot. The list goes on, according to the rabbis. And finally, God decides, all right, I'm going to take from the rib. And then, as he's creating Eve, he says, modest woman, modest woman, modest woman. That's God, according to the rabbi's depiction. And then the rabbis conclude that Eve and every other woman after her was not terribly modest. In fact, just the opposite. Now, if you turn that on its head, who won this particular challenge? Eve. God was unable to control Eve. And so I think of these texts where God is playing with the Leviathan as God's willingness to admit that forces that are in the world are to be a source of playful reimagining, not just threat. Personally, I think it would be good to imagine a lot of, frankly, white, cisgender, heterosexual male power as being unable to control us. Just the behemoth is not just any creature. But if you take a look at the book of Job, the behemoth is described as first of the ways of God. And folks, that Hebrew is really interesting because you can either read it in a way that says the behemoth is the greatest of all creatures God ever created, the greatest, trumping, pardon the expression, the existence of humanity, right? Or you can read it as the behemoth was the first to be created, the first being God created. Have any of you ever thought about that? The behemoth as God's first creation? A non-human animal is what God makes first? Isn't that amazing? Like, if that doesn't turn your whole sense of what's important, i.e. human animals first, upside down, then think again, because the idea that human beings are to control all non-human animal creation is completely contradicted by this text. So it's something also to think about. Also, behemoth, the name is literally formed, as I write here, from the plural of the Hebrew word behemoth, animal or beast. And it looks like this behemoth has a greater claim to God's attention in the text than Job. Who's coming first here? So, Ken Stone, in his absolutely stunning book, I highly recommend it to any of you. It's Reading Animal Studies with the Hebrew Bible. Writes, what does it mean that God finds prey for lions? What does it mean that God supplies eagle chicks and ravens with meat? What does it mean that God creates creatures who stand outside human values and knowledge, such as the wild ass, the wild ox, and the ostrich? What does it mean that God cares for Behemoth and Leviathan as much as Job? What does it mean that when pressed by Job and his friends to give an account of human suffering, God calls their attention to the existence in God's creation of predators and prey? Our religious traditions, our ways of reading the Bible run some risk, not simply of ignoring the beauty and ferocity of its wild animals, and the wild animals who still live in our own time, but also of domesticating the Bible's wild and ferocious God. He also writes, written as it was prior to modern humanism, biblical literature fails to provide us with a clear and unified picture here of a human subject that can be distinguished from what we call the animal. There may not exist a single biblical world, and that's something for us to be thinking about. So friends, is there a spiritual message I'd like each week to ask us to think? What is the spiritual message of all this nice scholarly and academic exploration? This is from Psalm 148. Praise the Lord from the earth, you great sea creatures and all ocean depths, lightning and hail, snow and clouds, stormy winds that do his bidding, you mountains and all hills, fruit trees and all cedars, wild animals and all cattle, small creatures and flying birds. Some of you know that one of the things that I have been working on for years is creating gardens which will support and encourage the flourishing of insect life. Some of you know that part of that project has been doing as much as I can to nourish the existence of monarch butterflies. Yesterday, the last of our caterpillars hatched. I know. I was ready to celebrate another birth. But the chrysalis of this monarch had fallen from the net, and though I tied it back up in a panic on Friday, in the hopes that there would be no injury, in fact, the monarch was unable to pump its wings full. For the next several hours, we kept hoping that this monarch would recover, but it never was able to fly. And I mourned all day yesterday for the loss of life. If we reimagine God as both the creator of all living creatures, if we imagine God and reimagine God as even embodying the nature, the features of things that walk and crawl and fly, if we could integrate our understanding of the importance of all life in a world that is continuously challenging our capacity to survive and the capacity of non-human animals to survive, then we would be saying a prayer and we would be taking action for the tikkun, the healing, that this world is desperate for. I'm hoping that this particular session will inspire you to think in just those terms. Thank you. And that, I hope, will govern our discussion. I changed Darren Guest's words. She spoke about persons, and I changed that word to animals. Darren Guest, by the way, is a scholar I have been corresponding a lot with lately, And some of that correspondence has been about monarch butterflies. So friends, questions?